You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. I'm sitting here with Mike Kofman, and we're going to be reflecting on the state of the war in Ukraine on this second anniversary week of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Mike, thanks for coming back on the show.
Yeah, good to be back on it.
The big news now is the fall of Avdiivka. This is a battle that began some months ago as Ukraine's own offensive had sort of effectively petered out. Talk about how we got to this, the fall of really Russia's biggest military victory in months on the battlefield, at least.
Let's be honest. In terms of the scale of fighting, it's not that big of a victory when we look at the city taken, but the battle is significant nonetheless. So last October, Russian forces began an attempt at a double envelopment of Avdiivka. Avdiivka was a pocket. It was essentially a salient of Ukrainian troops positioned not far from the city of Donetsk. The Russian military tried a fairly large-scale attack, at least for them, and they were operating something around at the battalion size level with a big armored push. The initial attempt to encircle Ukrainian positions at Avdiivka failed, and so then they began just a standard grinding assault with dismounted infantry and artillery support. And the fighting went on like that from October to November to December. Russian forces lost a lot of armored fighting vehicles in the initial assault. Look like Avdiivka was holding. Why? Avdiivka is a fairly well-fortified area. The Ukrainians have held Avdiivka since 2014. And the fighting sort of died down heading into the winter around January, and then it picked back up. And then there was another big push. And the Russian forces started steadily closing the pocket. And by the time we got into February, it was clear that Avdiivka was going to fall. And at that point, at least I thought, other folks thought that that's probably about the time when Ukrainian forces should begin an organized withdrawal. If you remember, actually, on the last podcast we discussed this issue. This is what I was suggesting, that Avdiivka was very likely to fall at that point. And so Russian forces broke through, started severing parts of the city, and then over the last week, the Ukrainian military had to withdraw. And what I think we saw in this fight was, first, for Russia, this was a very costly victory. Russian forces lost maybe 600-700 armored fighting vehicles. It was more than a combined arms army's worth of kit. So essentially spent a lot of the forces they generated probably in the 6 months in the run-up to the fight on this battle. It was pretty costly for them. Second, they were attempting to operate at scale, and then they switched back to mostly infantry assaults and then back to trying to engage in mechanized attacks. But it shows how difficult it is to get to a prepared defense. But the question is, what happens now? So there's a couple scenarios. The first is that they just basically even out the front.
Let's reflect on this a second. Is this really, obviously a loss is a loss, but since as you pointed out, it was a pocket. So it's not like this was the last line of defense for something for Ukraine or for a larger city. If this was Ukrainian-held territory, mostly surrounded already by Russian-held territory. So is it that significant of a loss strategically, or is this just sort of the latest in a series of...
So in the best-case scenario, it's not, but some big caveats. Avdiivka was fairly well defended. One thing folks don't appreciate is Ukraine does not have good secondary lines. It doesn't have something like the Surovikin lines the Russians built last year. In fact, Ukraine's quite behind on effectively entrenching across the front. Most of the areas where they were conducting offensives last summer, whether it's down south by Rykhiv, if it's around Bakhmut, they actually hadn't established very solid defenses there. So Avdiivka is a case in point. Behind Avdiivka, Ukraine has some defenses, but it's not a strong line. And the issue is that, on the one hand, the Russian military may run out of momentum, right? But on the other hand, if they're able to solely sustain these kind of offensives and pushes over the course of this coming year, then eventually they may find more and more open terrain from these pockets. So it's a potentially a slippery slope where you get like a death by 1,000 cuts, or essentially death by 1,000 localized offensives. And the second part is, why did this happen? First, Ukraine had a real deficit of artillery ammunition.
Right, that's what I wanted to get to next, is if Ukraine aid had not been held up in Congress for as long as it was, do you think we would have gotten to the same result anyway? It just would have taken longer? Or do you think that was the difference between Ukraine holding the city, at least for the foreseeable future, and not? How important was that?
So I think we probably might have still gotten the same result, but I think it would have taken much longer, and I think it would not have endangered the rest of the line. Now Russian forces are attacking south of Orikhiv to roll back Ukrainian gains there. Now they're attacking outside Bakhmut. The Congress holding up military assistance is a very significant factor, and it's going to be much more visible to everybody in the coming months if this issue doesn't get solved.
So what you're saying is not only did it make Avdiivka fall faster, although it probably might have eventually fallen anyway, but it also cost Ukraine a lot of time in fortifying its lines in that part of the country.
Well, it also cost Ukraine a lot more men, because the second issue Ukraine has is that Ukraine has, in some areas, depleted units, but it's just suffering from a shortage of manpower, particularly for infantry. And now you have the combined deficit of not being able to replenish, reconstitute the force, right, and not being able to compensate for that with a reasonable amount of artillery fire. Russian forces are able to establish significant superiority in fires and in manpower as well in these localized offenses, right? So one challenge Ukraine has to solve, and we can talk about that later in the podcast, but it can't solve the deficit of artillery ammunition. That depends on the West. And then the third part is defensive lines. Like, Ukraine needs to prioritize the construction of defensive lines along the front. This was approved last November by the president, but it's advancing, I think, at a relatively slow pace.
So now let's go back to what happens next. So Russia is attacking elsewhere now. How does Russia now take this opportunity? It's taken Avdiivka, or the ruins of this once. I saw some photos of the city before the war. It was beautiful. But this completely ruined city, where does Russia go next? What are its choices? What are its options?
They've been attacking along a couple points in the front, up north in Kupiansk by Kharkiv, by Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, down Avdiivka, and they're trying to launch attacks south of Orikhiv, which was where the main effort in the offensive was last summer for the Ukrainian military. In Avdiivka, the terrain behind Avdiivka is fairly flat, right? So what the Russian military, if it has any momentum, and here I'm skeptical because they've lost so much combat power fighting over Avdiivka that they may need a pause. But we'll see. It's very hard to tell because...
And they did not seem too concerned about losing all that combat power, which signals how confident perhaps Putin is about his ability to mobilize more volunteers and then what he's getting from annual conscription.
Yeah, so they were able to contract a lot of men last year. I think far more than people know or appreciate. There was a recent Russo report out that said that they had met 85% of their quota. That may be a bit high and optimistic due to some double counting, but what I will say is that I think there's a relative consensus amongst analysts that Russian recruitment numbers last year of people they contracted really exceeded expectations. Not theirs, not the official numbers they're putting out. Ours. Certainly mine. I'll be honest, certainly mine, and that's a lesson learned as to how many men are willing to take money to go and fight on the Russian side. But so they have the manpower, that's for sure. Their biggest deficit is equipment, because they lost so much kit in this one particular fight. It does show that there is some efficacy to an effective defensive strategy that attrits Russian forces. This is one of the theories that I've been pushing, that Ukraine at the very least can try to hold and make Russian forces pay a dear price. But it is important to know when to withdraw. The challenge with this withdrawal is, from my point of view, is that it looked messy again. It looked like Severodonetsk back in 2022. It looked like when Ukrainian forces were pushed out of Soledar in January of last year, and looked a bit like Bakhmut, meaning it was very clear that the time to withdraw was by the time we got into February. And it still required a rescue operation by Ukrainian Special Forces, by 3rd Assault Brigade to try to hold the front open, and last-minute evacuations, and, some people being caught as POWs and what have you. So it didn't look great. And this is one of the things that I think Ukrainian military the new leadership is going to have to look at, one of their challenges at least over the coming year.
This is a good segue into the next part of our conversation, but I think one thing that Ukraine has done very poorly is, and we've talked about this in previous episodes, is take advantage of the immense amount of space they have. Ukraine's the second largest country in Europe besides Russia, and to trade space for time rather than sort of defend everything to the hilt and then end up being disappointed. But before I go on to the next part of our conversation, I want to highlight the latest episode of the Russia Contingency where Nick Danforth and Aaron Stein interviewed you. I think was just amazing. Not to blow smoke, but it was really a masterclass in sort of military analysis and looking back at the different choices that both Ukraine and Russia made early in the war. And I just want to highlight a few clips from that episode.
In some respects, Ukraine was saved by sort of the plan B and plan C that different folks had within the establishment, right? And the fact that Ukraine's military leadership's illusion, I think in many respects, saved the day with an 11th hour order to disperse and deploy Ukrainian forces, many of which were still in garrison. I don't know if he was authorized to give it, but my impression was that the Ukrainian overall assessment of the operating environment changed in the last day, that they had changed the assessment from invasion not being imminent to being imminent. And then this kind of provided the backing for an order to then sortie Ukrainian units and disperse. That was a critical decision because it essentially preserved a lot of the Ukrainian force and allowed them to escape catastrophic losses in the initial Russian set of strikes, first and foremost. It saved a lot of Ukrainian air defense, which proved critical to denying Russia air superiority and stymieing the Russian air campaign. Many of the Ukrainian units that sortied forward were just getting out of garrison and deploying, meaning they had not arrived to any prepared positions or where they were supposed to defend. They encountered Russian forces in meeting engagements, right? And a lot of volunteers and the other units had to try to stall the Russian advance. So the bottom line here is that a lot of this was a sort of a rapid Russian invasion that wasn't expecting significant resistance, meeting with Ukrainian units who were deploying and sallying forth, also not too well prepared or established positions, and a lot of fights that ended up being quite close.
But anyway, back to this conversation. I want to spend the rest of the episode reflecting on Ukraine's theory of victory and the West's theory of, I wouldn't even call it the West theory of victory anymore, the West theory of not completely allowing Ukraine to collapse, unfortunately, because I don't think the West has a theory of victory anymore with Ukraine. But let's start with Ukraine, and let's talk about manpower. Earlier, you referenced Ukraine's manpower woes. I think a lot of people are surprised to learn that, is it the mean or the median age at the front on the Ukrainian side is about 40 years old?
Yeah, I would say it's probably more like 43 to 45, best guess.
Which is pretty striking. I mean, the intensity of this combat is just unlike anything any living U.S. service members have experienced for this prolonged period of time. And the 40-year-old body is just not built. Speaking as a 40-year-old.
Yeah,
the 40-year-old body is not built for this. And these are also forces that are not being rotated out of the front regularly. They're supposed to be rotated every 3 days. They're lucky if they're rotated, from what I read anyway, every week, 2 weeks, even longer in some cases. And so the strain that you're putting on, frankly, middle-aged people, when Ukraine has quite a lot of young people that haven't been mobilized. And I still have to confess, even though I've been trying to read everything I can that I can find, including in Google translated Ukrainian on this, I have trouble understanding why there is not a more aggressive political coalition for mobilizing more and younger men in Ukraine. There's a draft law that's still being debated. The business community opposes it a lot. It was going to be people as young as 25. Now it's only people as young as 27. But even those years make a difference. There's a reason why the most elite infantry force in the world is the Marine Corps, which is mostly made up of 19-year-olds. So help me understand what the hang-ups are on the politically, or maybe it's the recruitment process or the training process on mobilizing more people.
Here's my view on it, and I'll admit that there's plenty of political nuances that even I myself may not fully understand here. But first, the previous law had the bar of the age of 27, but what I heard is de facto they were not recruiting people really below 30. And the reason for that was a conscious policy, right? First, the political leadership didn't want to recruit younger people for two reasons. They saw them as a demographic future of the country. Ukraine has far fewer people in the 20-year-old age bracket than it does in the 4-year-old age bracket. Ukraine's demographic structure, if you look it up online, does not look good at all. And so if you use up these people, you're kind of using up the future of your country in a sense. This is issue one. Issue two is that it would be very politically unpopular, right? Young people obviously have parents.
But there's a disconnect here. There was a poll that the Munich Security Conference recently publicized that 92% of Ukrainians only favor victory. That includes all of Ukrainian territory, again, even including Crimea. But if all these people support this and are sort of burning their boats on that beach, but they're not willing to make those sacrifices necessary to do it, there's a real problem in Ukraine for mobilizing to win this war.
Sure. If you add a second question to the poll of how many of you would sacrifice your 20-year-old son for the political objective, maximalist political aims that the first question proposes, you would get probably a fairly different answer.
Which makes that 92% number basically irrelevant in practice.
Yeah, and also just my own view, I'll put my political science hat back on. Polling doesn't always reflect preferences. It reflects the preferences often people think that they should have necessarily.
Expressed versus revealed preferences.
Expressed versus revealed preferences. So, yeah, on the poll, it's very easy to agree with maximalist war aims. When it comes to the question of where you're willing to sacrifice or do for it, for example, let's say you say, okay, well, if that took 100,000 total casualties more, 200,000 or something like that over the course of multiple years, what would that look like? Here's my view. So when it comes to younger people, yes, I think that part of the reason is that would be politically unpopular. Ukraine needs more men in general to both refill formations, create new units so that it can rotate exhausted formations off the line. You can't rotate them unless you have somebody to rotate them with, which means you got to get another brigade somewhere to pull that brigade off the line. And you need to reconstitute the force as well, right? So you need to bring additional capacity into the force. Okay, so there's a base additional number of people that they need, and they need younger people. Why? Because assault infantry it's something that's much harder to do when you're older. By the way, Ryan, you'll be surprised how many emails I get from our colleagues in our 40s who all kind of cringe and react to my commentary about 40-year-olds not being nearly as suited to this work as they think they are.
Yeah, it's probably the same people that think they could like wrestle a grizzly bear successfully in a fight or something like that.
Yeah. And over the winter, a close friend of ours basically in a discussion kind of giggled at, and then he tore his ACL playing tennis and now has to walk around with one foot in like a bicycle scooter. Yeah. But back to this conversation, the reason I say this is that there is no substitute to some extent for fitness. People think that technology has reduced the requirements for fitness, right? That you can basically operate drones and now you don't have to be fit. Actually, in many cases, the opposite is true.
And Jack Watling wrote a great article on the larger analytical takeaway on this for us recently that we'll link to in the show notes.
He had a very good piece on the fact that Tommy doesn't necessarily reduce the manpower requirements, it pushes them more into support role, which I think is very true. We found even in current assaults that the ratio of people doing the assaulting and the people who have to support them via drones in some cases is 1-to-1, right? So, but in general, drones denying mobility near the front means that you have to hoof it those last 6 kilometers with all your gear just to get to your positions before the assault, okay? If you want to be a drone operator, you have to drag the drones and all the equipment out with you forward. So there isn't the sort of Xbox version of the war that we've entered where fitness doesn't matter anymore and you don't need assault-capable infantry. All right. When it comes to the law, my understanding is the law is currently in second reading. One of the challenges I see is that the administration isn't nearly that supportive of the law, which is it's not clear who is the political champion of this law that is essential for Ukraine to be able to sustain its warfare.
I get the sense that Zelensky understands he needs to do this, but he is not throwing his full political heft behind it.
Yeah, but it's very clear to understand how Ukraine is going to carry forward in the war without a serious change to mobilization practices.
And one has to wonder, and I know that there's a lot of problems in the training pipeline, and even if they were able to mobilize more people, there would still be hang-ups downstream. Absolutely, and we could talk about that. But I can't help but wonder if one of the reasons the mobilizing further is so unpopular, or unpopular enough to hold it up like this, is that Ukrainian families have seen the way that their manpower has been used, particularly in places like Bakhmut, to get basically nothing for Ukraine. And they lost so many people for basically what I think was just basically useless almost.
I have some nuanced views on Bakhmut, but I think it was last year one of the more demoralizing battles. And people don't appreciate how demoralizing some of these fights can be. I think that Avdiivka, for example, from an attrition standpoint, was a very good fight for Ukraine to pick. From October through January, right? But the withdrawal could have been better managed. And the only reason I think this criticism is really useful It's not just for, tactical or operational improvements. It's so people understand that when they see a withdrawal that's not very well managed, it doesn't do great things to morale or motivation to sign up, right? And so it's important that there's a sense that there are lessons learned. One area where I'll give credit is that Ukraine did not adopt the Bakhmut mentality in Avdiivka. Nobody launched a PR campaign called Fortress Avdiivka and tried to make it symbolic.
Directed bullying of people online who were critical of what they were doing.
Yeah, I remember that through the course of last year. We got a lot of criticism for describing the situation as it was, and Syrskyi actually officially ordered the withdrawal, which was notable. Like, actually posted it and gave the order, which I think was the right thing to do. But yeah, so some of these fights obviously have been demoralizing, plus the offensive last year wasn't successful. So the biggest issue is people now ask, well, what's the vision? What's the theory of success? What is the point of mobilization? You cannot just ask for mobilization. You can't just ask people to send, their husbands or their sons or their daughters to war. You need to also lay out a vision that sounds like they're going to be fighting for something that's achievable, other than the theory of success is we're going to be fighting over the tree lines outside of Bakhmut for the next year, right? Or something like that. And this, by the way, this is what a chunk of the fight was last year. So people need to hear a strategy.
Let's talk about trading pipeline issues. What are some of the problems that remain there?
Capacity. So localized capacity in Ukraine needs to be significantly expanded. I think Ukrainian military is on it and has seen that challenge from the beginning of the war. Capacity in the West as well. One of the challenges that makes the question of mobilization related to Western resources provided and material assistance is that if Ukraine is going to mobilize all these men, the West needs to come through with the resources to help train and equip them, right? Because Ukraine by itself, I don't think has the capacity to take in huge amounts of mobilized manpower of this kind. It can mobilize them, right? But actually training and equipping them and turning them into additional units, this will require Western support and assistance. And so you end up in this situation where you're sort of looking back and forth at each other across the table, where Ukraine says, United States and other countries are going to come through with military assistance in order for me to be able to mobilize these people and do something with them. Otherwise, they're a huge hit to the economy, right? That's the challenge for Ukraine, is that you're pulling more and more people out of the economy. And this is why businesses are aware of the mobilization law. And it's not clear that you have the resources to actually turn them into combat-capable formations.
And this, of course, is all taking place as Zelensky has just fired Zaluzhny as the chief commander of Ukrainian forces, who was, I think it's no exaggeration to say, literally the most popular person in Ukraine, maybe besides some pop stars. And in his place hired Syrskyi. What do you think that does to the strategy, to morale, to what we might see over the next year?
It's not just about replacing the commander-in-chief. They replaced the entire military leadership within the general staff, right? Syrskyi is appointing a new team. And on top of that, they're reviewing current brigade commanders across the brigades as well. So we might see further changes to the leadership essentially trickling down and spreading to the force. I think Syrskyi definitely has a challenge in terms of his reputation and addressing his image, which can happen to a commander. But more importantly, he's inherited a situation in the military. Avdiivka is a situation he inherited from Zaluzhny and Tarnovsky, and it was not heading in the right direction. The issues of manpower mobilization he's also inherited, right? The issue of...
How much of these were Zaluzhny's choices versus Zelensky imposing choices on Zaluzhny?
It's
Bakhmut and other things.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a combination of the two. I think when it comes to the big choice on strategy, the political leadership has always had supremacy, and I think some of the calls that...
Which is how it should work in a democracy.
It should.
They have the right to make terrible decisions. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The political leadership, absolutely. That's why I remember I always say military strategy is political in nature. The political leadership shows up and says, these are the objectives, and this is what's a priority for me, and I'm going to make this battle, let's say, politically symbolic, and I want you to hold it, even if it doesn't make much military sense. All right. To get back to this conversation, yeah, I think that so some of those choices were definitely driven by the presidential administration. It's hard for me to parse exactly who's responsible for it, but suffice to say that Syrskyi comes in at a very difficult time, right? Russia's materially advantaged this year. Western military assistance is at best uncertain for this coming year. Ukraine's options are not great, right? It ideally can hold, if there's enough resources, it can try to reconstitute the military's combat power, and it can expand strike campaigns against Russian forces. But this is going to be a very challenging year for Ukraine. And so Syrskyi's coming in after a period of some internal turmoil. Let's say that when it comes to civil relations and firing a commander-in-chief, that was probably not the best way to do it, right? Like it certainly didn't look like the cleanest thing I've seen in replacing military leadership. So for me, I'm willing to keep an open mind and see what happens under Syrskyi's leadership. So bottom line, the challenges Ukraine faces are first, material. Second, manpower. Okay. Third, prepared defenses and infrastructure, right? And fourth, laying out a vision that is a strategy that is something that can be agreed upon ideally between Ukraine and Western countries that the West can support, that is tied to a reasonable expectation of the resources that they can assume to get this year.
Zelensky is putting a lot of hope in, I think, and I sympathize with the reasons why he's doing this, because he's not getting what he needs from the West, especially in terms of artillery and missiles. He's putting a lot of hopes in drone production. He's creating a separate drone force, or he's ordered the creation of one. I'm not sure if it's actually been formally created yet. And trying to put a lot of emphasis into these FPV drones. Can FPV drones make up for lack of depth and capacity in artillery and other systems?
The way I look at it, so FPV drones and tactical strike drones in general, they can offset some of the artillery requirements, particularly when defending, and they can take over some missions and tasks like counter battery fire, for example, for artillery. So they're particularly useful when you're on the defense. But FPV drones do not substitute for artillery. It's very clear that folks don't engage in magical thinking. In fact, these drones have not replaced really any conventional weapon system or legacy weapon system in this war. They don't allow you to take terrain. They are useful, and in a number of ways, FPV drones can help Ukraine effectively hold, even if Russia holds material advantages. It can make those material advantages less decisive for Russian forces, especially given their challenges in employing force at scale.
Because it makes them harder to mass. It makes them harder to bring forces to the front and achieve what's necessary for a breakthrough. Am I getting all the
absolutely
sound logistics, et cetera, et cetera?
Right. But the thing about these drones, and Rob and I have a lengthy kind of piece coming out soon, getting into all the kind of nitty-gritty tactical, technical details and nerding out on the subject.
Where is it going to be?
It will be at FPRI.
All right, keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, for those who are interested, we're going to dive as deep as I think you can in the subject in that piece. But, okay, so the bottom line, FPV drones, effective, but I think folks are leveraging or hinging a bit too much of their hopes on the sort of army of drones concept. And on the one hand, you kind of have to, because you have to offer a theory of victory given all the constraints you're dealing with. On the other hand, it's important not to turn the drone conversation, a tech innovation conversation, into intellectual alibi where you can forgo the fundamentals, right? And the fundamentals are fixing the force, reconstituting the force, right? Addressing prepared defenses, addressing the munitions crisis, consolidating the force, rationalizing the equipment you have in it, putting the force on a more sustainable footing. The drones are not going to resolve these issues, right? They're a very good supplement or complement or offset to certain things. They're not a replacement. And military cultures in general, particularly in the West, we often tend to lean towards tech innovation first as our first solution in the war. But part of the reason that drones are most effective is you have to remember context. Both sides are struggling with being able to employ forces at scale, which makes the drones much more effective in defending against these types of attacks, right? Fine. But you also have to be careful with the notion that investing further in a technology that brought you into a relative deadlock or makes it difficult to make progress on the front is what's going to get you out of it. In some respects, it actually could be the technology that helps to further and further solidify the challenges or the inability to conduct maneuver at scale.
Yeah, I mean, to oversimplify, machine guns caused a lot of problems for different armies in Europe in World War I, and also didn't solve any of their larger operational and strategic problems.
But yeah, the way I think about it is nobody in World War I said, the way to get out of the situation on the Western Front is if we build just a much better, heavier machine gun, right, and that'll improve mobility.
I saw you observed on Twitter over the holiday weekend that there was a troubling complacency at the Munich Security Conference from our European partners. What did you mean by that?
This is my impression, and obviously I wasn't there, but a lot of colleagues were, and I was reacting to something Shashank Joshi, the defense editor of The Economist, wrote. He's a good colleague and friend, that there was a general sense, and I've heard this plenty of places over the last month or two, that Western officials, despite all the challenges, despite the problems we face with providing assistance and Russian material advantages, don't expect significant changes at the front this year, and that a number of them think that it's heading towards kind of a long war and a stalemate. And I just think this is very much not the case. I see complacency.
The current course we're on, that's probably, unfortunately, the best case scenario.
Yeah.
Is an enduring stalemate.
Yeah, that's not the course we're on, though. Right? The reality is...
I'm saying best case.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think that folks just sort of assume that if they don't make hard choices this year, this thing will sort of solve itself, which, by the way, is a very, very common mindset for politicians. If something isn't going well and you don't want to make the next set of difficult political decisions to address it, maybe it's easier to assume that it'll just become a stalemate and then the thing will freeze itself and so on and so forth. But that's not a likely outcome.
After its disastrous invasion attempt, Russia more quickly realized what kind of a war it was in than the West, and in particular the United States and Europe. I think Russia understood by the spring, we got to be in this for the long haul. It's going to be ugly. It's going to be difficult. But if we can drag this out for a few years, we can be ultimately victorious. And I think it took a lot of people, including in the White House, probably until the summer or fall of that year to accept that this would go on for even another year.
Sure. And I think that's a bit of an oversimplification. But I think what happened when Russia invaded initially is that Ukraine mobilized first. Russia then mobilized second in September of 2022, realizing that it was in for a long war. And the West didn't mobilize in practice.
Yeah, we're patting ourselves on the back. There was this announcement that a Finnish munitions plant is on 24-hour shifts. And we're acting like that's a huge accomplishment 2 years into the war. I mean, the lack of seriousness in Europe in particular is remarkable. And I have to say, I think it's particularly galling that Mark Rutte, the Dutch prime minister, who was personally responsible for holding up increases in Dutch defense spending from 2014 forwards, personally responsible for his country not spending more on defense, is now trying to present himself as a hawk, as what seems to be the favorite insider's choice for NATO Secretary General. And so there's just so much hypocrisy on the European side on this. If we don't insist that the next Secretary General comes from a country that has been meeting the 2% minimum threshold, I think it's just a massive, it's just absurd.
No, I mean, one thing I'll say is, props to Finns, and Finns at the very least were doing a lot of things quietly that they weren't talking about over the course of this war. But in general, my view is that, yes, the Western countries have invested in increasing production. We've talked about this over the last 2 years of this podcast. But in terms of real mobilization of effort, it hadn't been done. And I think a couple of the reasons for that was, one, people early on assumed that this was already a strategic failure or defeat for Russia, however you want to put it. And so the kind of urgency and impetus maybe wasn't felt. A lot of folks didn't appreciate the kind of arc of a long conventional war and the reality of a long war, and that many of the things actually were still in question in this war. And lastly, where we are now is a lot of these people don't appreciate that Ukraine could very well start losing the war this year, and that the logical conclusion of this war isn't necessarily a stalemate, and that it has very significant implications for European security. And the reason I keep emphasizing that is that while there are prospects for kind of rebuilding Ukraine's advantage, I think people also just need to be cognizant of the fact that
we need bolder thinking. Industry needs orders. Industry cannot open up and expand production lines unless they have orders from governments. And this is just from ministries, and this is just not happening. And, kudos to Denmark for announcing at Munich, we're turning over all of our artillery to Ukraine. And they appear to now be meeting the 2% target, according to some recent reporting, although I'm not sure if that's actually correct.
Yeah.
So we need more of that. I mean, if you border Russia, the floor really should be 3.5% of GDP. The floor.
So let me offer a comparison. Russia's spending officially 6% of GDP, unofficially probably 8% or more this year, in order to try to really take the advantage in generating momentum behind its war effort, right? And let's look around the West and we compare Western rhetoric about the importance of this war, the importance of supporting Ukraine, And then look at how much people are actually spending on defense, and what does it appear to be worth to them, and the implications of this war. And is it anything remotely approaching what you see the adversary spending? It doesn't have to be 6% or 8%, but for a lot of countries, it's nowhere near half that. They're just important to reflect upon because, in general, the West has the advantage in capital, in technological innovation, and in industrial capacity over Russia. If you look at the countries involved.
Latent industrial capacity.
Yes, latent industrial capacity. Correct. If you spend the capital on it, right? Capital plus latent industrial capacity plus tech innovation, these are our principal advantages. We are where we are today because of the choices that were made or not made in 2022. And what folks need to appreciate is that they take on the, I'm pretty sure this might be a stalemate mindset. Here's what's going to happen. They won't make the choices they need to make in 2024. And that's part of the year, right? And that will determine all the options available in 25 and 26. And they will be partially responsible for why the war is lost in those years.
Thanks for sitting down with us. We're going to end it on that grim note. Don't forget to check out our membership program, including Mike's show, The Russia Contingency, which we had a nice clip from earlier in the show. Become a War on the Rocks Platinum member at warontherocks.com/membership. Stay safe and stay healthy.